So I'm going to ask you a question, and you can answer it. The question is it true that only healthcare workers experience compassion fatigue? Yes or no? And the right answer to that is no. So let's talk about compassion fatigue. What is it? Well, compassion fatigue in a person who's experiencing it looks like extreme exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. It's like a sort of soul exhaustion that happens to people who have to engage in long-term, chronic, nonstop caregiving, or who are continually exposed to the trauma of other people. People who experience compassion fatigue will say that they feel wiped out, that they feel numb, they feel like they don't have any more empathy or care to give to anyone else. They may feel like they're cynical. And to the world, if you don't know that someone in your world is experiencing compassion fatigue, it may look to you like that person, like their empathy is off, or that they're really detached or don't care and they sort of look numb. Now remember what compassion is. Compassion itself is basically when empathy gets turned into action. You have the feeling of empathy, of care for another person. So then you do something in line with that, right? So compassion is often not just the listening and empathizing, but also you bring them the soup, you listen to them, you offer to help. And folks who are experiencing compassion fatigue may do fewer of these compassionate acts. And when and if they do, they're much more detached when they do them. People with compassion fatigue tend to be much more focused on let's get the thing done, the tasks, and they focus less on their feelings and emotions. Compassion fatigue has actually been called secondary traumatic stress, like traumatic stress once removed. It has also been called caregiver burden. But the specific term compassion fatigue, it has a profound impact on the person who's experiencing it, more than you'd realize. And people who are going through compassion fatigue will often wonder if something is wrong with them, or will question themselves and wonder if they themselves are cold, because it can really feel like their empathy feels it's faded. And you might, if you have compassion fatigue, you'll be listening to someone's story and saying like, thinking in your head like, I actually don't care, and feel bad about that. There's a really good paper I read by someone named Debbie Stowen. We put the abstract in the video notes about compassion fatigue in professional settings. She describes the fallout of compassion fatigue, and it's interesting. She describes it as including sadness, anger, annoyance, intolerance, impatience, irritability, skepticism, like you don't believe people, cynicism, embitterment, resentfulness, not being able to get along with people as easily, shifts in closeness, intimacy, a lack of interest in being close to others, social isolation, mood swings, anxiety, tearfulness, despair, not being able to think as clearly. I know some of you are saying, "Ooh, that sounds familiar." Now, compassion fatigue can really mess up close relationships because the compassion fatigue means that you don't have it to give. Being close just feels like one more thing to do. There can also be a sense of inadequacy and helplessness in people who are experiencing compassion fatigue. Now, here's the rub and here's the problem. Typically, when we talk about compassion fatigue, especially in the formal literature, even that article I just talked about, it's applied to people who are in professions, in jobs that involve caring and helping. Healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, nursing assistants, allied health professionals, like a respiratory therapist, nursing home workers, therapists, psychologists, counselors, social workers, first responders, EMTs, for example, paramedics, people who work in crisis support settings, people who may even volunteer in settings like a domestic violence program with people who are experiencing trauma, people maybe who even engage in animal rescue where they've been seeing animals who have been harmed. Now, little, though, of the compassion fatigue literature really reflects on people in relationships. This isn't their job. This isn't their volunteering. This is the relationship they're in. And this can include relationships with family members, partners, just having to care for the people in your life. Unpaid work, not your job. And that often means that there is no escape. And you may also have to do your regular paid job alongside these caregiving roles. And the more complicated the caregiving, the less of a break you ever get from it, the more likely the compassion fatigue. So let's turn this in a different direction, okay? Which you know I'm going to do. It really made me think about compassion fatigue and narcissistic relationships. Listen, there are few things on the planet less fulfilling than having to be a caregiver to a narcissistic person. Because when you are, I promise you this, you aren't doing it right, you aren't doing enough, and they'll tell you that you don't care, despite all the sacrifice you are making to care for them. Narcissistic people may feel entitled to you caring for them, basically that you owe them. There often is little gratitude. It is a bad scene to have to be a caregiver for a narcissistic person. Now, for people in narcissistic relationships, there's a real problem. It's all empathy out and no empathy in. Now, the difference is that in many narcissistic relationships, you may not actually be in a caregiving role per se. Like the person you're in a relationship with doesn't need you to help with meals or medications or going to doctor's appointments or changing diapers or packing lunches or any of that, right? But before you really understand what narcissism is and how this personality style shows up in relationships, you may have spent your time in the relationship just trying harder and harder to solve problems, to listen, to go the extra mile, to try harder again, to be perfect, to appease them, to cheer them up, to reassure them. It may not be the usual caregiving stuff of medication and meals and cleaning someone up, but it does mean putting someone else's emotional and often physical needs first ahead of yours. You may make sure, for example, even if you're in a narcissistic relationship with someone who can make themselves a damn sandwich, you make sure that they're fed when they're hungry, but you wouldn't do that for yourself. Your needs don't get addressed in these relationships. And because in narcissistic relationships, what you're doing all the time doesn't look like traditional caregiving, you may not understand why you are feeling this exhausted as someone in a more traditional caregiving role would look like. When you go back and were to listen to all that list of stuff, the things that happen to somebody who's experiencing compassion fatigue, it sounds a hell of a lot like what happens to a person who is in a narcissistic relationship. I feel that something that gets missed in the overall compassion fatigue conversation is that we tend to focus on the exhaustion of caregiving. It's an important thing. Don't get me wrong. It's a really important thing. And what a person does, the other thing we focus on is what the person does as part of their caregiving. Now, some of the compassion fatigue conversation even might focus on if there's any meaning and purpose a person might get from their caregiving as a hedge. For example, that's why a lot of parents of young children, there's a lot of caregiving, but there's meaning and purpose, maybe in being a parent. But this literature doesn't focus on whether the person doing all of this compassioning and caregiving is supported by other people. And this is where the parallels with survivors of narcissistic abuse really kick in. I actually believe that the loss of empathy, the detachment, the sort of indifferent who gives a shitness, the why bother, the nothing works anyhowness, as well as the emotional and physical exhaustion of compassion fatigue that very much parallels what survivors of narcissistic relationships go through. A lot of this is what fuels the self-blame of survivors even further, with people going through narcissistic relationships sometimes thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I am a terrible person. I don't really actually have that much empathy for people anymore. I am kind of an a-hole. I really don't care about other people's stuff nearly as much anymore. And you sure as hell may be exhausted from chronically having to one-sidedly care about the narcissistic person and their needs and getting absolutely nothing back. Compassion fatigue can help survivors understand why you feel like you are tapped out in the empathy department. It's all out and very little in. And that inversion, coupled with having to always do for the other person in the relationship, and not only for it never to be acknowledged, but also often for it to be gaslighted, means that one could easily argue that what survivors of narcissistic relationships go through may sometimes be worse than traditional healthcare worker compassion fatigue. The having to give, do more, and be supported by the job less and less, or not make enough money. You're going to experience this compassion fatigue, right? It's going to be a crash when you're going through it at work. But in people in narcissistic relationships who do give, do more, get less support, less everything, and at the same time are also told that they are greedy and selfish and stupid and demanding and ungrateful, well, that's next level, right? And I will acknowledge, and I know many of them, that there are people who work in helping professions, especially lower paid jobs in these professions, in workplaces with gaslighting bosses and supervisors who go through this and may also experience the worst compassion fatigue, right? So obviously this would magnify it for a person even in the healthcare workplace. And since people in narcissistic relationships often lack support, things like not having access to therapy, they're more likely to feel socially isolated. They're more likely to have a sense of shame about their situation. They may not have as many sort of close people in their world. The things that can help with compassion fatigue, like social support, aren't always available. And even when a survivor has a lot of people around them, they don't always know what's happening in your relationship. When we see this parallel, that folks experiencing compassion fatigue look a lot like folks going through narcissistic relationships, I do hope that survivors of these relationships can understand their overwhelm, their exhaustion, resentment, frustration, anger, sadness, and social isolation, but also understand your guilt. That feeling of, I feel bad because I just don't care anymore. Now, it's very similar, and this phenomenon of compassion fatigue is very real. Survivors often bash themselves for not being more empathic with the narcissistic person, with the enablers, with other people. There is an origin story to you who's often been empathic throughout your life, to not always being able to be the perfect empath all the time. Empathy is not a bottomless well that fills itself. Even a well has to be replenished by the rain. And if it's not, we crash in every way. And then we feel guilty to boot. So compassion fatigue is real, and I see very much this phenomenon happening in survivors of these relationships. They often think it's not them because they're not doing the traditional caregiving stuff, right? Like, the doctor's appointments, the medicines, the feeding, the meals. No, they're thinking this person's autonomous. They're just going through their lives. But you're actually doing a hell of a lot more caregiving than you think, and realizing that there's almost none of it coming back.